Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday Bible study for the Bremen Church of Christ. It's good to have you with us. We are in Revelation chapter 21 tonight. We're going to pick up there. Of course, we will, as we usually do, we'll do a little bit of a review. As I said last week, let me get my PowerPoint pulled up here. Nope, that's chapter 20. Sorry, I'm going to move this mic just a little bit closer. I think that'll help my sound. As we have been doing, we're going to do a little bit of a review. I mentioned this last, I think, couple of weeks. I've had to shorten the review just a bit because I don't want to run out of time, and I don't want to spend all of our time on the review because, you know, it's a review. So I'm going to get over here to see if I can get out of the way, and then we'll switch to the PowerPoint as the larger view here in just a moment. But I keep clicking away from the PowerPoint. Chapter 21 is dealing with the eternal glory. I just realized my air conditioner kicked on. Let me go. I'll leave you on this screen. I'm going to turn that off because I know it's loud and it probably picks up on the mic. Okay. Sometimes I forget to turn the air off or turn it up high enough so that it's not going to kick on, but it makes a lot of noise, so I figured I better cut that off. Chapter 21 is dealing with the eternal glory. As I mentioned last week, maybe the week before as well, this is all kind of coming together now. Hopefully you see that, and this passage, I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit, but it seems to be talking about the church in the glorified state, the church at rest with God. We read chapter 21 and we often talk about heaven from chapter 21, and I think it's hard to separate the two. And again, I'm going to mention just a little bit because there's two different ideas prominent, two most prominent, we'll say that, ideas. But one of them is this is the church at rest in eternity, which again, that basically is heaven. So, I think you're really splitting hairs, as we sometimes say, to try to differentiate there. But the song that we sang just a moment ago, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be, that came to my mind as I was thinking about this chapter because it describes the splendor and the beauty of the church glorified in eternity at rest with God, which of course is a picture of heaven. And then we'll sing in just a moment another song dealing with that, kind of that same theme. There is a habitation built by the living God, and that habitation is where he dwells with his people, and it is the church, the glorified church in eternity at rest with God. So that's the theme of chapter 21, the church, the eternal glory of the church. And you see this picture, this artwork by Pat Marvanko Smith. You have the city Foursquare, which is of course what we're talking about here. You see one of these gates described or depicted here, an artist rendering of that. Both of these are by Pat Marvanko Smith. And so that's what chapter 21 is about. Now, having said that, let's move into, there we go. Kind of froze up on me for a second. I'm going to switch to where I'm down here so you can see the review. Let's look at the review here and notice the introductory remarks, the letters to the 7 churches. That's what we see in chapters 1 through 3. You also have in chapters 4 and 5 the throne room of God. The question is, or John rather weeps because there's no one found worthy to open this scroll. This scroll is sealed with 7 seals, and of course the Lamb is found. The Lamb is worthy to open the scroll, and that's what's going to happen, and of course the Lamb there being Jesus. Chapters 6 and 7, really on into chapter 8, you have the 7 seals. The closing question of chapter 6 is who can stand, and that's answered with an interlude in chapter 7. The answer to who can stand are those who are sealed, marked by God. A lot of people talk about the mark of the beast. I'm more concerned about being marked as belonging to God. I'm his. He has claimed me as his own. And of course, that's for those who come to him on his terms, that obey him, obey his gospel. But those who are marked, those are the ones who can stand in the day of his wrath. So that's chapter 7. And then you get into chapter 8, the seventh seal is opened. You also have an introduction and partially the 7 trumpets. You see these ascending. It's like a crescendo of judgments. And again, not to go back and teach all that, but hopefully you've seen that as we've gone through these visions. I told somebody this is I've said it numerous times, this is my first time to teach the book of Revelation this in depth. So if I had it to do over again, and probably, Lord willing, at some point we'll study this again sometime, I think next time when I teach this book, I will teach it in not by chapters, but by visions. There are these visions that are happening. You have the throne room vision, you have the sealed scroll, you have the vision of these 7 seals being opened. You have the vision of 7 trumpets. Sometimes you have an interlude, but you have these main visions. The woman and the dragon, getting into chapters 12 and 13. And I'm getting ahead on my review here, but you hopefully have seen that. The judgments of the great harlot, Babylon. And now we're in another section, another vision. This vision, if you wanted to title this vision, it's victory. Really getting into chapter 21 and 22 is, it's the eternal glory. It's part of that victory vision, but you can almost make it stand alone as well. But when I teach this book again, if and when I have the opportunity to teach this again, Lord willing, I think that's what I'm going to do, is go based on the visions, because that makes more sense. And sometimes the chapters, as you can see just here in our review, sometimes, for instance, here you have chapter 8 and on into chapter 9, the 7th seal is open. Well, that began up here in chapter 6. Then you have trumpets 1 through 6 that are in chapters 8 and 9. Of course, trumpets 5 and 6 are woes 1 and 2. They're called the first 2 woes, and the 3rd woe is also the 7th trumpet. But again, you have an interlude, measuring the temple, the 2 witnesses. That's 10:1 through 11:13. And then the 3rd woe. But the trumpets, and of course trumpets 5, 6, and 7 being the 3 woes, that's all one vision. So it makes better sense to study all that together. And I think we've made it work, certainly by doing it by chapter by chapter. And that's a convenient way to do it, and sometimes makes it a little easier as far as finding a stopping point. But sometimes you're stopping right in the middle of a vision, and that's the reason I say probably next time I won't necessarily do it that way. 12 and 13, as I mentioned, you have the woman and the dragon. This radiant woman. I think the King James has it worded as she's arrayed with the sun. Then you have the dragon's 2 beasts. You have a beast out of the sea, which represented Rome. And then you have the beast out of the earth, which represents the cult of emperor worship. Then you have the 7 bowls of... No, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Chapters 14 through 16, you have righteous judgment. The warnings are expressed, and then there is a reaping. Remember, the reaping is pictured as like a wheat or some kind of a grain harvest. And then you also have it pictured as a vintage, like treading out the grapes. And then the 7 bowls of wrath in chapters 15 and 16. 17 through 18 is the infamy and fall of Babylon, that great harlot, and we talked a lot about that in that section. That really goes through that entire section. Chapters 19 and 20 deal with chapter 19, victory. Chapter 20 was last week, the 1,000 years, and of course, the final judgment. Now, that brings us to... I keep clicking on over here on my software. That brings us to chapter 21, which, as I said, is the eternal glory. You got 2 divisions here, basically. Verses 1 through 8, all things are made new. Old things are passed away, and that was kind of there at the end of chapter 20, if you recall from last week. Now all things are made new. And then the second section here is verses 9 through 27, which deals with the New Jerusalem. By the way, this section will continue, and this is another one of those where just the chapter break doesn't do it justice. But this description of the New Jerusalem is going to continue on through chapter 22, verse 5. So keep that in mind. We won't get to all of that tonight, so just bear that in mind. Now, I touched on this just a moment ago, and I want to come back to it. There are two views typically for the vision of chapter 21, verse 1, that goes again through 22:5. There are typically two most logical, prominent views for this vision. Some people view it as the victorious church as seen now by God. This is the church purged, purified through the tribulations they've passed through. That's how some people see it. I think it's plausible, possible. I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't think it's the most likely, but it certainly doesn't damage the text. It doesn't go against, it's not like premillennial doctrine with, the rapture and Jesus coming to reign on earth and all of this. It's not like that, where that implies false doctrine and gets you way off away from the rest of biblical teaching. It certainly could be the victorious church here in chapter 21. It's been through these trials, and I keep saying it, but we understand the church is the people. Here are God's people. They've been through these trials, these tribulations. They're purged, they're purified, and now here they are as seen by God. Maybe. Again, I just don't think that's the most likely. Number two option here, again, these are not the only two views, but probably the most typical ones you'll run across. And certainly the only two that make much sense at all. I have not seen anything else that I thought was just worked at all within the context of the rest of the book and the rest of Scripture. But number two is the church at home with God in its final glory, which again would be in heaven. So you basically have here a description of heaven. I think, it certainly stands to reason the faithful church is glorious in God's eyes. It is the bride of Christ. But I think the second view here, the church at home with God in its final glory, I think that just makes more sense within the context of the book of Revelation. You cannot just take chapter 21, and separate it from the rest of the book, obviously, and I'm not saying anybody's trying to do that, but here, bear with me and notice this. Beginning in chapter 12, you have the birth of the man-child, you have the assault on the church by the dragon, you have the church going through trials, you have war waged against the church, against God's people. There is the destruction of the harlot city, the sea beast, and the false prophet, who is also the beast out of the earth, same one. You have this judgment against them. They're the great enemies of God's people, the church. And then you have this final conflict with Satan, his doom, his destruction. You have the passing of the current world, or the current order, I think is the way that Brother Haley puts it a lot of times in his commentary. You have the final judgment of mankind, and then you have the punishment of the wicked. What naturally, logically follows after that? Logically, the next sequence would be the final glory of the church at rest with God when time is no more. I just think that's the most logical, contextually logical explanation that you can find for this passage. Again, the first one doesn't do any damage to the text, doesn't contradict other passages of Scripture, but context matters. And I think in the context, you can only say one thing logically follows here, and that is a description, a vision of the church in its final rest at God, with God. The church at rest is what I'm trying to say, with God in heaven when time is no more. And we sometimes say when the morning breaks eternal. That's how we iterate it in one of our songs. So I think that's the most logical explanation. That being said, that's how I'm going to approach it in our particular study tonight. So again, I don't have any issues with the other one. I just think contextually that makes the most sense. Now let's get into the text. I'm trying to decide if I want to read from the King James or American Standard. I'm going to go with the King James for right now. There's just very slight variation in them, but in Revelation I've seen a little more variation, and sometimes and you'll see this later on in this chapter, but there are times when I just think the ASV gets it a little bit better. Beginning at verse 1, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, And they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he saith unto me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. Let's stop there and talk about these verses. This verse 1 is going to introduce the new heaven and the new earth. I say introduce, it's here in Revelation, but this is not a new concept. You may recall from chapter 20, verse 11, the present order, the cosmos is the Greek word. We spell that with a C. In the Greek, it would be with a kappa or kappa, depending on how you pronounce that. But it would be a K in English is how that's, but it's where we get our word cosmos from. This is all passed away. But in chapter 20, let me find the verse 11. I saw a great white throne and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. So the present order, or the present cosmos, is passed away. Sea here, I'm going to go ahead and mention this. Sea here in chapter 21, verse 1 indicates the sea of humanity. Sometimes it's just the sea, as we've seen in the book of Revelation. Sometimes it's the sea of humanity. I've told you before, I have a note. In fact, I think it's in this. This is a really old American Standard. Let me see if I can get it on camera. You can probably look at this thing and tell it's pretty old. But that was given to me by Brother Ed Smith, who was the preacher when I was at Oxford. I was working with the youth there, and this was back in summer of 2000, I believe, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time ago. But it was old then, and I believe it was his daddy's to begin with, and he gave it to me. But there, sometimes I think it's in this one. I don't see it right off, but anyways, it may not be in that one. But anyways, there's a note in one of my Bibles, and I don't think I made it. I think somebody else made it, but it's the statement that in the book of Revelation, sea means humanity, which is true. I might even say most of the time, but it's not true every time. And you've seen that if you've been following with us and been a part of this study for any amount of time. We've seen instances where it meant simply the sea, the body of water we often refer to as sea or seas. But just like in 13:1, the first beast rose up out of the sea. That meant that was representative of the sea of humanity, from which nations rise, and the upheavals of humanity and so on. And we talked about that in that context. Well, here it's the sea of humanity. So just keep that in mind. New heaven and new earth. I said it's introduced here. Again, I'm using that term kind of accommodatively because it's introduced here in Revelation, but this is not a new concept. This always refers, this phrase, new heaven, new earth, new heavens and new earth, it always refers to a new state of existence. It's used 3 other times in the Bible. Sometimes people have this idea that the earth is going to be renovated at the end of time. It's not going to be destroyed. It's going to be renovated, and heaven's going to be on earth. I just, I've studied that some. I haven't studied it just super in depth, but I can't find any justification for that in Scripture. There's just too much evidence that this earth is going to pass away. This earth's going to be done away, and our eternal abode is in heaven. Not on a renovated earth, not heaven come down to be heaven on earth, but in heaven. There's just too much biblical evidence for that. And it's not my purpose to get into all that, and that's a whole other study for another time. But I do want to say this. When you study Scripture and you see this term, new heaven and new earth, again, sometimes it's new heavens and new earth, it's always referring to a new state of existence. And you have to look at it contextually and see what is it meaning. What is it meaning here? What is it meaning here? What is it meaning here? It's used 4 times in the Bible. As I mentioned here, 3 other times besides right here in Revelation 21. But again, we've already noticed in 20 verse 11, what was the wording? I've already forgotten it. The earth and heaven fled away, for there was found no place for them. I think about Jesus' words in Matthew 24:35. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. There's just so many statements we can go to. Again, I just think putting all of Scripture together, it's pretty clear this earth's going to be destroyed. And the new heavens and new earth is referring to a new state of existence, not literally a newly created earth a newly created heaven, or heaven come down to earth to be heaven on earth. Again, it's not the purpose of our study here, but it is worth mentioning because sometimes people have that idea. But just looking at the 3 other times this is mentioned in the Bible, this phrase are very similar. It's going to be kind of a cursory study here because, as I said, we don't have time to get real in depth with that. But there are 3 other times besides Revelation 21 where this term or phrase is used. One is in Isaiah 65, verses 8 through 25. And number 2 would be in Isaiah 66, 15 through 24. Now, specifically, it's Isaiah 65, 17, Isaiah 66, verse 22. Those are connected because they're in the same context. And in fact, I'm going to do this here while I'm sharing my screen. Let me switch over to my Bible software. And I'll take the ASV comparison off here just for make it a little simpler. And let's go to Isaiah. In Isaiah 65, now again, I'm going to have to move quickly through this because it's just, we don't want to get too far off what we're talking about here in Revelation 21. But it is important because this term is used here in Revelation 21. But if you can see here on the right side, and I'm going to leave Revelation 21 over here for comparison. I'll get up to verse 1. Let's get rid of the cross references. So, Isaiah 65:17, for behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered, nor come into mind. And he goes on and he has some more to say there. People sometimes try to apply this to some kind of millennial reign of Christ on earth. Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world, John 18:36. There is no millennial reign of Christ on earth. We've already dealt with that last week in Revelation 20. This passage here is often, misused to talk about that. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. And they say, in the millennial kingdom, even the wolf and the lamb, they're going to feed together. The lion's going to eat straw like a bull, and the dust will be the serpent's meat. And this is not meant to be literal. This is a picture of the gospel age, the gospel dispensation. But my point here being is that if you go into chapter 66, what did I say, verse 22? It's still in that same context, talking about this new state of existence. And it's still all connected. He doesn't state it as if it's something new. It's still within this same context right here in verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. So here you have in Isaiah 60, 65, and 66, that's 2 of your references to the new heaven and new earth. I also want to point out here, let me get back to our PowerPoint. I also want to mention here that this really is detailed in chapters 34 through 66. Isaiah, the first part of the book, deals a lot with, it's kind of, for lack of a better term, gloom and doom. There's a lot of sin. God says, I'm not listening to you. Your hands are filled with blood. You can worship, you can offer prayers, but I'm not listening because you're hypocrites. And he says, you mistreat people, you cheat people, you are, it's hypocritical. And so God says, I'm not listening, and there's a lot of judgment that is passed down from God through Isaiah in the first part of the book. Of course, chapter 6 details the call of Isaiah. God says, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Isaiah says, here am I, send me. That's the first part of the book. And even within that is the world city, the judgment of the great world city, Babylon. And we notice the comparison to Revelation, the great city, the harlot city being judged in Revelation 17, 18, and the victory on into 19. So all that, but when you get to chapter 34, right thereabouts, kind of shifts gears, and it's going to start looking off to the future, and Revelation is going to start, not Revelation, Isaiah is going to start talking about this coming glorious dispensation, this coming glorious age, kingdom, and it's talking about the church. So it really goes from 34 through 66. I've got the verses there, if you want to write those down. 34, 3 and 4 is a good place to look at. 51, chapter 51, verses 4 through 6, and also verse 16. We just don't have time to go and look at it in depth, and so I'm gonna have to resist the urge to keep talking about that. But you see, this new heaven and new earth is not a new concept. What did it mean in Isaiah 65 and 66? It's a new state of existence. It's talking about the church. It's no longer a physical nation, it's a spiritual nation. And boy, do people still get off on that today. That sometimes people are still thinking in terms of a physical kingdom. They're looking for a physical kingdom. Well, that's not what he's talking about. 2 Peter 3 is another place. Isaiah's two different mentions of the new heavens and new earth. The third is in 2 Peter. I'm going to go back to my screen here again with the Bible software so that we can bring those up and compare them. 2 Peter 3. Because I want you to see this. It's strikingly parallel to John's vision here when you get to 2 Peter chapter 3. I don't have time to read all the way chapter 3. Verses 3 through all the way down through 14. Specifically, verse 13 is where it mentions the new heaven, as you see it down here, new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. But I want you to think about this. There is a talk here in 2 Peter 3, verse 7, of the judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. Now you parallel that with Revelation 20, verse 13. The sea gave up the dead which were in it, death and Hades delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. So you'll have that judgment and destruction of ungodly men in this vision of Revelation, same as in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. 2 Peter 3, verse 10. You have the passing of the present heaven and earth. The day of the Lord is going to come like a thief in the night. The heavens shall pass away with great noise. The elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Some translations have laid bare. That still doesn't help the cause if you're trying to get away from the earth being destroyed, because laid bare, it's a textual difference. And even if you go with that, it's just the idea of, as we noticed in Revelation 20, where the earth and the heaven fled away because there was no place found for them. In other words, it's laid bare. If that's what the word is in the Greek, it means laid bare for destruction. There's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go. This earth is passing away. So in 2 Peter 3:10, you have the passing of the present heaven and earth. We've read several times Revelation 20, verse 11, where there's that great white throne, and from whose face, him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. So again, passing of the present heaven and earth, and followed immediately by the coming of a new heaven and earth. Again, getting into 2 Peter chapter 3, you see it here in verse 13, and Revelation 21. I've got 10 in my notes. That's a typo. I was looking at my notes here. It's 21:1 is what we're trying to say. So you have a new heaven, new earth. The first heaven and first earth were passed away. So again, there's a parallel there between those two. Go back here and I'll show you where I have this, but I got a typo there. So just if you're writing down those references, just note that Revelation 21, that's supposed to be verse 1. But again, you see the parallel. So the new heaven, new earth, it's not a new concept. It's always referring to a new state of existence. It's not parallel with Isaiah, because Isaiah is looking to the gospel age, the gospel dispensation, the church age, we sometimes call it. Whereas 2 Peter 3 is strikingly parallel. And so you see that would be the most parallel passage as far as the actual meaning of this new state of existence. It's heaven. Again, doesn't seem to be any evidence that this is heaven on earth or something, a renovated earth, something like that. Brother Haley says this on page 406 of his commentary. Isaiah wrote of the passing of the old Jewish order and the inauguration of the new under Christ, whereas both Peter and John wrote of the passing of the new state of which Isaiah wrote, and the introduction of the final and eternal order beyond the judgment. I couldn't word that any better, so I just wrote down the quote from Brother Haley, because that's it. Isaiah is telling about the passing of the old Jewish order, and there's the inauguration of a new system, a new dispensation, a new law, a new kingdom under Christ. Peter and John write about the passing of that. That's going to be That's going to give way to eternity and the heavenly home. When earth is destroyed, earth is no more, there's judgment of the wicked, of the ungodly, and the reward for the righteous, for the faithful. I know that's a long explanation, but sometimes people get tripped up by that. And again, sometimes people have this idea that, well, is that talking about the earth's just going to be renovated? It sounds like in 2 Peter 3, the earth's going to be destroyed, but then here it sounds like there's going to be a new earth. What's the deal? So that's the reason I want to take a little extra time to discuss that. But let's move on to verse 2. We read that already. Verse 2 is going to discuss the new Jerusalem. New here means new in kind. I meant to put new there. Finding all kind of typos. By the way, I appreciate sometimes you all catch typos that I don't catch. My wife caught one last week where I had put verses, I think, 11 through 21 when it was verses 11 through 15. There weren't even 21 verses in chapter 20. But anyway, hopefully you figured out what I meant. I didn't even see the notes she sent me to help me see that until after class was over. But I appreciate those who helped me. Believe me, when I find those typos or you let me know, as soon as class is over, I go into my PowerPoint file and I correct them so that for next time I've got that fixed. But what I was trying to say here is new. The word kainos or kainos in Greek is the original word that's here translated new. It means new in kind, superior to that which was before. So this is superior, this new Jerusalem. Just like the present order, Christianity, the church age, the church dispensation, or the Christian dispensation, just like the present order has its holy city, which is Jerusalem. It's not physical Jerusalem, spiritual Jerusalem. Galatians 4:26, in his allegory, that his inspired allegory, Paul makes this statement: but Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. Jerusalem which is above, that's the spiritual Jerusalem. That's the holy city for the church. It is the church. Hebrews 12:22, you're coming to Mount Zion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. Again, that's a reference to the church. Just like the present order has its holy city, so the new heaven and the new earth have a new holy city, a city that befits God's magnificent spiritual creation, the church. It's coming down out of heaven. That indicates it's divine in its origin. This is the city that was sought by the patriarchs of old. You know, Hebrews 11:10. He looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. This is that city. It's the church, but it's pictured here as a city. And of course, in this context, you know, there's just, again, you don't want to split hairs, but it's talking about a new city here, but it's the church. It's just the church in its glorified state at rest with God. Again, you could basically say heaven. This is the city sought by the patriarchs. The city is arrayed in all the splendor of a bride on her wedding day. Now again, you can go back to chapter 19, verse 8. You may recall our discussion there. To her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. She's to be presented to the Lord in purity. We noticed that, I guess it would have been when we studied chapter 19 2 weeks ago. Hebrews 5:25 through 27, about how Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And it goes on that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. The purity of the church as the bride of Christ. The true beauty and glory of the city, of the bride, are described in chapters 21, or verses 9 of chapter 21, all the way through 22:5. So he's going to get into a discussion of this true beauty and glory of the church, the bride of Christ, the new city. He's going to get into that beginning in verse 9 of this chapter, and it'll go through chapter 22, verse 5. I want to stop here and notice something, because don't forget this, and maybe you've already put this together just from that last bullet point. How is a city a bride? How does a city become a bride, or vice versa? This is not literal, folks. This is a vision. This is a vision with symbols to convey ideas. Remember what we said all the way back several times in the beginning. I think it's Brother Stafford North that mentions this in his book, It's a much more cursory overview type study of the book of Revelation, but he uses the expression several times, and he has the idea of a man with arms like this. Here's what it says. Here's what it means. Here's what it says. What does it mean? Says city means the church. Says bride means the church. This is not meant to be taken literally. Sometimes people get so literal with this. Well, a city cannot be a bride. A bride cannot be a city. And yet, here we have it. That tells us this is symbolic. It's conveying the idea of the grandeur of the church, eternally at home and at rest with God. Keep that in mind, symbolic language. We've emphasized that a lot in Revelation because we have to, because so many times people get off track taking things literally when they're clearly meant to be symbols, conveying ideas, what it says, what it means. Verse 3, the tabernacle of God is with men. The voice here speaking is not identified. This may be the unidentified speaker of 1617 or the unidentified speaker of 1905. Maybe God, maybe Christ. Whoever it is, it expresses the message of God to those who are being addressed. John brings several familiar symbols together here. He talks about the church as the bride of Christ. You see that in verse 2. He talks about in verse 3, the church is God's sanctuary. It's God's family. It is a body of individuals. All those are in verse 3. Again, symbolic language. Is it a temple? Is it a bride? Is it a city? Is it a family? The answer to all those is yes, because they're all pictures to describe the church. You may recall, those who are Bremen folks, it's probably been a couple of years ago, we did a study of names of God, and we didn't do an exhaustive study, but we looked at several names of God. Is God's name Jehovah? Yes. Is God's name Elohim? Yes. Is God's name Adonai? Yes. All these different names. I was trying to think of some more, and I'm just drawing a blank. Jehovah Nisi, that was one of them. All these different names that we looked at, and we pointed out, these are not meant to be, it's not that God has 20, 30 different names. These are all descriptions of who God is. They're pictures of who he is, what he does for his people. Sometimes even in pictures of judgment. Jehovah, Yahweh, it means I am. He is. He's not the I was. He's not the I will be. He is the great I am. So John is bringing these symbols together to help describe the church, especially in this glorified state, to us. The tabernacle in heaven has been in view twice before, in chapter 13 and also in chapter 15. The Old Testament tabernacle pointed to the new that was built by the Lord, not man. Hebrews 8:2, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. Hebrews 9:11, but Christ being come and high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. And so the Old Testament tabernacle pointed to the new, which will be built by the Lord, not man. It's a spiritual tabernacle, in other words. Only Jesus could build that one. But it's also the one where God dwells. That the old was pointing to the new, which is the one where God dwells. Ephesians 2:21 and 22. In whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also, talking to Christians, are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to sing in just a moment, there is a habitation built by the living God. That's the church. But here it is the church at rest in heaven. The Old Testament tabernacle pointed to that new tabernacle. Haley says this, God's presence among his people now reaches its zenith as he dwells or tabernacles with them in heavenly fellowship. What a wonderful thought. There is a habitation built by the living God. Truly, as we often say, how beautiful heaven must be. All right, let's go to verse 4. Sin and death are swallowed up in victory. The old heaven and the old earth have passed away, and with them everything that tainted or polluted life here on earth. Sin's fruit, of course, is death. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. James 1:13 through 15, it says there, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. and sin when it is finished. I believe some versions have this a little more accurately, a little more exact. Sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Sin's fruit is death. But not just sin and its fruit here. Every associated ill with sin is gone, is removed. Sin and death are swallowed up in victory. The pure delight of being with God is described by 5 negatives here. There are no tears, no death, no mourning, no crying, no pain. How wonderful to think about it. Again, I keep thinking of the song, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be. That's why I wanted to play that song and have us sing that leading into our discussion tonight of the church at rest with God in heaven. Because sin is no more, these are no more. No death, no tears, no mourning, no crying, no pain. What a wonderful thought. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And when that enemy is destroyed, then the church, the faithful of God, are eternally at rest with him. Verse 5, all things are new. It's difficult here, again, to determine who exactly is speaking. It could be God, could be Christ. They both sit upon the throne. We see that in 3:21. Christ acts in the Father's behalf. We see that in chapter 5 where he's opening the seals on behalf of the Father. But either way, it could be either one of those. In contrast to what is removed, as we saw in verse 4, now all things are made new. Similar terminology is used to describe a Christian. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are made, or all things are become new. Here, in Revelation 21, the old order is passed away. Again, this cosmos, this earth, and all the material universe is destroyed. All is made new. John is again instructed to write here. I find this interesting, by the way, verse 5. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much because we're not told for sure. He that sat upon the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said unto me, write, for these words are true and faithful. It reminds me, again, I can't be dogmatic about this, but I wonder if John was not like sometimes we were in preaching school. Sometimes I remember I was blessed to sit at the feet of some great godly men. Sometimes Brother Cates would be teaching, and sometimes it would happen in Revelation class. In fact, Brother Cates has such a unique style. I've mentioned this before to the Bremen folks. He had a very unique style of teaching, and it was very difficult to take notes from him, but you could just sit and listen to the man for hours. And 20 plus years later, I can still I can hear him, I can see him making some of these same points, even though I don't have them written down in notes. I don't have them exactly written down, well, Brother Cates said this, but I can just remember it. But sometimes we'd be just sitting there, and I remember Brother Cates, Brother Mosier, his classes were always just some of my favorites. And I remember sometimes we'd be sitting there, and you're just kind of like this, and you're listening, and you're so into it. And sometimes even the teacher might say something, Brother Dollahite, are you going to take notes today? And you kind of go, oh, yeah, okay, sorry. And you just get carried away. And I wonder if maybe that's what's happening here is John is so carried away with his vision. Can you imagine seeing this? He's so carried away with the new heaven and the new earth and this vision of the church. I mean, John's in exile, folks. He's suffering for the word of God. He says, I'm your companion in tribulation over there in chapter 1. Can you imagine he's seeing this? And it's all, you've come through the dark tunnel of suffering and judgments, and now the church at home with the Lord. And John is just maybe dumbfounded. And I just sort of wonder if it's like this voice is kind of saying, come on, John, write. You're supposed to be writing these things down. And I wonder if John kind of shook. Oh, yeah, sorry. I don't know. Again, I can't be dogmatic about that, but I think that's pretty interesting. I thought about myself in preaching school and how sometimes we would get caught up. Sometimes, there were other times we were kind of snapped at to write. Maybe we were dozing off, but I definitely don't think that was the case with John here. But maybe this voice, whether it's God or Christ, whoever is speaking, is getting John's attention because he's just so dumbfounded by the whole splendor of this vision. The words bear the signature of Jesus himself, faithful and true. Remember from 1911, that's a description of Jesus. It's like he's placed his personal signature on these words, this message. Probably the things to be written, when John is told write, probably the things to be written would include all of verses 1 through 8, because that makes sure this all-important message of assurance is preserved for all humanity for all time. Now, verse 6. He said unto me, It is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. In verse 6 here, basically all is done. It is done is the saying in the King James. All has come to pass is how the American Standard words it. Haley identifies the speaker here as Jehovah the Father, but he adds that you can't be dogmatic since Jesus claims the same in 22:13. This is one of those rare occasions where I would tend to disagree. I think it's probably Jesus speaking here. Usually that you associate that with Jesus, and I'd have to do some more study on that, because again, I don't disagree with Brother Haley very often, because he's pretty sharp, especially on this book. I've been so impressed with his scholarship studying the book of Revelation along with him through this commentary. But I don't know, I still think contextually it makes more sense to be Jesus here. The scheme of redemption and the revelation thereof originates and terminates with God. It begins and ends with God, in other words. And God in the Old Testament repeatedly said he alone, he and he alone is deity. There's so many verses in Isaiah 43:10. I am he, before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. Isaiah 44:6, he says, I am the first and I am the last, and beside me there is no God. Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. Isaiah 48:12, hearken unto me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am he, I am the first, I also am the last. He says over and over again, he alone is deity, and he verifies this by the fulfillment and the culmination, the carrying out of the scheme of redemption in Christ Jesus. Only deity, only God could so accurately foretell, to come up with, to foretell, and to fulfill such a plan. No one else could do that but deity. And so just as God, you see this here in verse 6, just as God provides the water of life in our present dispensation, the gospel age, Jesus talks about that in John 4:10. You would have asked for living water, he tells the woman at the well. He says in John 7:37, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He is the water of life, in other words. So just as he provides it in our dispensation, just as the shepherd guided those coming out of tribulation to fountains of water of life, we see that in Revelation 7:17, so assurance is given of abundance of the water of life in heaven. Verse 7, there's a blessing to those who overcome. And if you recall from chapter 12, I always forget this wording, so I'm going to go back here and look at it real quick. Chapter 12, verse 11, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. So this is talking about those who overcame by those means. Each of the 7 letters to the churches in chapters 2 and 3 promised a reward for those who overcome. In verses 6 and 7, you have the fulfillment of the exceeding great and precious promises mentioned in 2 Peter 1, verse 4. As you have the saint, the faithful saints having heard at this point, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, as Jesus mentions in Matthew 25:34. So the church in glory has the glorious presence of God, immunity from death, sorrows, grief. None of those things, again, verse 4, those are all done away. Not only that, the presence of God, immunity from death, sorrows, and grief, an abundant supply of the water of life. But I feel like, kind of like Billy Mays here, but wait, there's more. Because added to all this is the assurance of eternal relationship with God, as of a son receiving his inheritance. I will be his God, and he will be my son, is the promise. What, again, no wonder if I'm correct, and maybe John was dumbfounded here and he was told, right, no wonder. What an amazing description, and what something so great to look forward to. Verse 8, the character and destiny of the wicked here is contrasted. There is a marked contrast with the inheritance of the righteous. This ought to serve as a warning to those who are alive then and now, because after death it's too late. It's appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment, Hebrews 9:27. But he mentions several categories of people here. There are the fearful. These are the people who are cowardly and timid. I've got the verse somewhere here in my notes. Hebrews 10:38 and 39. Now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draw back, that's the idea of drawing back in fear, timidity. My soul shall have no pleasure in him, but we are not of them who draw back unto perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. And he's writing to Christians there. He says, you can draw back and you can be lost. But he says, I'm persuaded better things of you, brethren. We're not going to be cowardly. We're going to stay the course. And boy, especially in the book of Revelation, in the context of their suffering for Jesus, there's a great application there. So the fearful, the unbelieving, these are people that deny Jesus through their lives and their conduct. Luke 12:46, the Lord of that servant will come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in sunder, and will appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. The abominable, these are morally and or spiritually foul people. They have drunk of the wine that the harlot is said to have in her hand. What is the exact wording there? Chapter 17, verse 4. A golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. They have partaken of that great harlot's awful mixture. So the morally and or spiritually foul here. Murderers, those who willfully and maliciously take innocent life. From back in all the way in Genesis 9:6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. These are those, this goes back to the patriarchal dispensation. It's mentioned in the law of Moses, and it's mentioned in the law of Christ. God has always said murder is absolutely sinfully wrong. Fornicators, the King James has whoremongers. Sexually immoral. This is mentioned in Galatians 5 with the works of the flesh. It's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. Hebrews 13:4. Marriage is honorable among all. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, literally. And the bed undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers, fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Then he mentions sorcerers. This would be a devotee or devotees to magical arts, especially drugs, potions, spells. It's a word from which we get pharmaceutical. It's like pharmakeus in the Greek, I think. Pharmakia is the word you'll see later on in Galatians 5:19 through 21, where it talks about sorcery. But here it's sorcerers. In fact, it's the only time this form of that word is used in the New Testament. But again, you see it in Galatians 5, I guess you call it a cognate. Idolaters, worshippers of false gods, whether visible or invisible. In fact, in Colossians 3:5, he specifically says covetousness, which is idolatry. So it may not be worshiping a stone or silver or some kind of a literal physical shrine or idol of some kind. It may just be something like covetousness or sports or something of that nature. But idolaters. And then, of course, all liars. Anyone who practices what is deceitful or false. In verse 9, there comes another angel which has the 7 vials. One of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials or bowls full of the 7 last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And so he carries him away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. And her light was like unto a stone, most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. And had a great wall. It had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates. And at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city and the gates thereof and the wall thereof. Let's go through 15. I feared we wouldn't get through all of this chapter. This is one of the longer chapters in the book of Revelation. If we can get through 15, we'll be at a good stopping point. The New Jerusalem here. The description of the Lamb's bride and his marriage was introduced in chapter 19, 7 through 9. Now it's resumed in more detail. But instead of seeing a beautiful woman adorned in bridal attire, as you would expect, John sees a city. And again, that shows this is not literal, this is symbolism. The Lamb has a bride that is a city. Now you picture that and try to make that literal. It's symbolism. The ASV seems more accurate in verse 10 with the holy city as opposed to that great city is what the King James has. Great is always used in Revelation of the harlot city, Babylon. One, Babylon, is the object of God's wrath. The other, the holy city Jerusalem, is the object of God's favor. Some people want to know, is John seeing the vision of verse 2 a second time, this city coming down out of heaven, or is he repeating it for more detail? And it seems to be the latter. He's repeating it for more detail. But the emphasis here is on two truths. The city is holy, and the city is from God. It is divine in origin. Verse 11 begins a discussion of the exterior of the city. This will go through verse 21. Again, we'll finish this part up next week. The city, this is dealing with symbols. In fact, I think I'm just going to stop here because we are just flat out of time. And this is a good point to stop. I was going to say 15, but I think we can stop here and be okay. I'm going to come over here so I can get out of my PowerPoint. We're going to stop there. I didn't want to take as much time as I did on some of that, but I also wanted to make sure that we covered that thoroughly because the whole new heaven and new earth thing, sometimes people get confused by that. They wonder what's that talking about, and sometimes people wonder, is this talking about the church as God sees it now, or is this talking about heaven? I think it's the church at rest with God in heaven. I think that makes the most sense. So it's a great picture of heaven, and it's just a magnificent thing for us to look forward to when we endure all the sufferings of this life, when we, and look, sometimes we suffer more than others. Some folks suffer more than others, but it's the idea of being faithful to God through it all. Be thou faithful unto death, Revelation 2, verse 10, and I will give thee a crown of life, even to the point of death, overcome by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of our testimony, and by not loving our lives to the point that we're willing to die for Him. And we do all that. We come through the tunnel of suffering. We come through the tunnel of this world and all the things that were this world and the effects of sin. We come through all that. There's a new state of existence awaiting us, a new heaven.